Dear friends, there comes a time in every person's life when they witness something that changes how they see the world. This here story happened back in 1880 out in Colorado Territory, when folks still settled their differences with handshakes and hard work, not lawyers and paperwork. I've carried this tale for nigh on 40 years now, and I reckon it's time to share it proper. It's about a deaf woman named Anna and a drifter called Ethan, two broken souls, who found each other when hope seemed as scarce as water in August. Back then, the frontier was no place for the weak or the different. But sometimes the good Lord works His wonders through the most unlikely vessels. Their meeting beside a dying campfire would prove that the deepest conversations happen not with words, but with acts of simple kindness. This is their story of finding language in compassion and discovering that home isn't a place you stumble upon. It's something you build together, one gesture of trust at a time. The campfire had burned down to glowing coals when she stepped from the cottonwood shadows. Ethan Sawyer looked up from his tin cup, whiskey and creek water mixing bitter on his tongue. The woman stood just beyond the firelight's reach, hands pressed against her sides like she was holding her very soul together. Her calico dress hung loose on a frame that spoke of too many missed suppers. But she kept her spine straight as a fence post. "Move along, ma'am." He didn't raise his voice. In those days, a man didn't need to shout to be heard. "I'm not looking for company tonight." She took a step forward instead of back. Poor thing didn't seem to understand plain English. The firelight caught her face young, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back severe against her skull. But it was her eyes that made him pause mid-sip. They held the kind of wariness he'd seen in his shaving mirror for months now, the look of something that had learned the hard way to watch every shadow. She pointed at his supper, cold beans congealed in the bottom of his iron pan like paste, shook her head slow and deliberate. Then she touched her chest and nodded toward the dying fire. Ethan's grip tightened on his cup. "I said, I'm not interested, ma'am." The woman didn't flinch, didn't step back. Instead, she reached into the folds of her dress and produced something that made his breath catch in his throat. A small cloth bundle, tied with string worn soft from countless handlings. She unfolded it careful as Sunday prayer, revealing a pinch of salt that gleamed white as fresh snow in the firelight. Salt, out here in the territory, worth more than silver coins sometimes. She held it toward him, eyebrows raised in question. Her other hand made stirring motions over his cold pan, graceful as a church pianist's fingers. Ethan set down his cup slow and studied her face, searching for the catch. There was always a catch with strangers, but all he saw was careful hope, fragile as new ice on a water barrel. "You speak English, ma'am." She watched his mouth when he spoke, her gaze following each word like she was reading something written in the air. Then she touched her ear and shook her head, deaf as a post. The pieces fell together, her intense watching, the way she'd moved toward his voice instead of away from it. She couldn't hear his words because she couldn't hear anything at all. "Lord have mercy." Ethan pushed himself to his feet, joints protesting after a day in the saddle. The woman tensed but held her ground, still offering that precious salt like it was communion bread. He nodded once toward his poor excuse for supper. Her smile was barely there. Just a quick softening around her eyes, but it changed her whole countenance. She moved toward the fire with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd spent her life making do with less, banking the coals just so, setting his iron pan to heat proper. From her bundle came a dented spoon that had seen better days, a small knife with a bone handle worn smooth as riverstone, and a few leaves of wild sage that filled the air with the scent of summer evenings. As she worked, transforming his simple fare into something that actually smelled like a real meal. Ethan found himself watching her hands. They moved with the kind of sureness that came from feeding people who mattered, not just filling empty bellies. When she tasted the beans from the tip of her spoon, her nose wrinkled just enough to make the corners of his mouth twitch upward. She served him a plateful that steamed in the cooling night air, then settled back on her heels to watch him eat. The first bite made him pause mid-chew. The beans actually had flavor, now salt and sage, and something else he couldn't name but remembered from childhood, from his mother's kitchen, before the world went sideways. "Fine cooking, ma'am," he said, forgetting she couldn't hear his appreciation. But she was watching his face, reading his expression like scripture. That almost smile flickered again, and she ducked her head like she was hiding something precious. They ate in comfortable silence, her taking tiny portions that made his conscience twinge, while the fire settled into steady coals and the creek whispered its night song through the cottonwoods. When the beans were gone, she gathered the dishes without being asked and headed toward the water. Ethan caught her wrist, gentle, but firm enough to mean business. She went still as a spooked deer. He pointed to himself, then to the dishes, then to the creek. A man's work. She'd done enough for one evening. For a long moment they stayed frozen like that, his weathered fingers around her thin wrist, her eyes wide in the firelight. He could feel old rope scars under his thumb, healed but still there, circling her wrist like a permanent bracelet of suffering. She'd been tied up, recently enough for the marks to linger like a shameful secret. He let go slow, careful not to spook her further, and gathered the dishes himself. When he returned from the creek, she'd arranged her few belongings, neat as pins, the cloth bundle, a flour sack that likely held everything she owned in this world, and a thin blanket that had seen more seasons than it was meant for. She was planning to stay. Ethan wanted to tell her no, wanted to explain that he wasn't the kind of man who helped strays, that his protection was worth about as much as last week's newspaper. But the words stuck in his throat when he saw how she'd positioned herself close enough to the fire for warmth, far enough from him to run if the need arose. She wasn't asking for charity. She was offering honest trade. Her cooking for his fire, his presence between her and whatever darkness she was fleeing. Smart woman. Probably had more sense than he did. He spread his own bedroll on the opposite side of the fire and settled down with his back to a cottonwood trunk. His Colt lay within easy reach, and he made sure she could see it plain. Not a threat to her, a promise that anything else coming out of those shadows would have to reckon with him first. She wrapped herself in her thin blanket and curled up small, but her eyes stayed open, watching the darkness beyond the firelight, listening for sounds she couldn't hear but could feel in the vibration, yes, earth, the shifting of the horses, the change in the night air that spoke of approaching danger. Ethan found himself watching her instead of the shadows. This woman who'd appeared out of nowhere with nothing but salt and sage, and the kind of courage it took to approach a stranger's fire, who'd read the wariness in his eyes and answered it with careful and hope. Who was she? What had put those rope scars on her wrists and that particular watchfulness in her eyes? And why did watching her sleep, or try to sleep, make something in his chest loosen for the first time in months? The fire burned down to glowing embers, and still her breathing never settled into the deep rhythm of true rest. She was listening with her whole body, alert to dangers he couldn't even imagine. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he'd figure out what to do about her. Tonight, he'd just make sure nothing came out of that darkness to harm the woman who turned his sorry beans into something worth eating. It wasn't much of a promise, but it was something, and maybe something was enough to build on. Before we continue, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. Let's get back to the story. Dawn crept across the creek bottom, gray and cold as old pewter. Ethan woke to the smell of something that made his mouth water. Proper real coffee. Not the bitter chicory he'd been choking down for weeks. The woman knelt beside the fire she'd somehow coaxed back to life without waking him, working a small iron pot with the concentration of a watchmaker. Her movements held the kind of quiet efficiency that came from cooking in places where smoke might draw the wrong kind of attention. She looked up when his boots scraped against stone, nodded once, then returned to her work like they'd been sharing breakfast for years. Ethan pushed himself upright, joints creaking like old barn doors. "Where'd you come by coffee beans?" "Ma'am." She watched his mouth form the words, then pointed to her small cloth bundle. Inside, nestled next to that precious salt, lay a handful of brown beans wrapped in brown paper. Coffee. Real coffee beans. She'd been carrying them like treasure, and now she was brewing them for a stranger who'd done nothing but let her share his fire. His throat worked around words that wouldn't come. When had anyone last done something like this for him? Something small and careful and kind, expecting nothing in return. She poured the coffee into his dented tin cup, the liquid black as midnight creek water. Steam rose between them, carrying a smell that reminded him of Sunday mornings in a life he'd left behind in Missouri. The first sip burned his tongue, but he didn't mind one bit. It tasted like civilization, like sitting at a real table instead of squatting beside a dying fire. He closed his eyes for just a moment, letting the warmth spread through his chest like salvation. When he opened them, she was studying his face with the intensity of someone reading a telegram from back home. Whatever she saw there made her shoulders relax just a fraction. She reached into her flour sack and produced a small bundle wrapped in clean cloth. Inside flapjacks, already cooked, still warm from the iron, the kind his mother used to make before the war changed everything. Ethan bit into one, and the taste stopped him cold. Sweet. Somehow she'd made them sweet without sugar, using something he couldn't identify but remembered from childhood summers when the world still made sense. How? He caught himself. She couldn't hear his question anyway. He pointed at the flapjack, then raised his eyebrows in wonder. She mimed drizzling something from above, then pointed toward the cottonwoods. Sap. She tapped the trees for syrup in the dark hours before dawn, while he slept like a fool. Smart, resourceful, and quiet as morning mist when she needed to be. But as she reached for the coffee pot to refill his cup, her sleeve pulled back. Fresh rope burns circled her wrist, still red and raw beneath the old scars that told their own story. Fresh, recent enough that they hadn't even begun to heal proper. Ethan's hand stopped halfway to his cup. His eyes tracked from her wrist to her face, seeing the careful way she kept her head down, the way she positioned herself to watch both the creek and the tree line at once. She wasn't just running from something. She was running from someone who'd had her tied up yesterday. The dust cloud appeared on the eastern ridge just as Ethan was cinching his mare's saddle. 3 riders, maybe 4, too far to make out faces, but close enough to send ice water through his veins. In this territory, strangers approaching at dawn meant trouble more often than Sunday church. He glanced toward the woman. She was washing their breakfast dishes in the creek, her back to the ridge, humming something he couldn't hear but could feel in the vibrations through the morning air. The dust cloud grew larger, closer. Ethan's hand moved to his Colt, checking the cylinder out of long habit. 6 rounds. It would have to do. Ma'am. She didn't turn, couldn't hear him calling. He grabbed a smooth creek stone and tossed it into the water near her hands. The splash made her spin around, tin dish still clutched against her chest, eyes wide with the kind of alertness that came from living on the knife's edge. Ethan pointed toward the ridge. Her gaze followed his finger. And when she saw the approaching riders, every drop of color drained from her face like water from a broken bucket. The tin dish slipped from her fingers and clattered against the rocks, with a sound that seemed for loud as gunshots in the morning quiet. She bolted, not toward him, not toward the horses, toward the thickest stand of cottonwoods along the creek bank. She moved like a spooked deer, all desperate speed and wild panic, her skirts catching on brush as she crashed through the underbrush. Ethan found her crouched behind a fallen log, pressed against the rough bark so hard her knuckles had gone white as bone. Her whole body shook like she had the ague, and her eyes, Lord have mercy. Her eyes held the kind of terror that came from knowing exactly what those riders would do if they found her. He knelt beside her, moving slow and careful like he would with a wounded animal. When he touched her shoulder, she nearly jumped clear out of her skin. Easy now. The words came out rougher than he intended. Easy, ma'am. She couldn't hear him. But something in his face must have gotten through, because she stopped trying to burrow into that log like a rabbit in a hole. Her breathing came in sharp little gasps that misted in the morning air. The riders crested the ridge proper now, 3 men on horseback, moving at an easy lope down the slope toward their camp. Still too far to make out faces, but Ethan could see they rode good horses, too good for honest work. In this country. The woman grabbed his arm, her fingers digging through his shirt sleeve deep enough to leave marks. She shook her head frantically, then pressed her face against the rough bark. Don't let them see me. The message came through clear as church bells. Ethan studied the approaching riders through a gap in the logs. They wore decent clothes, sat their horses like men used to long days in the saddle, could be legitimate travelers, could be territorial marshals, could be the ones who'd put those fresh rope burns on her wrists. The lead rider raised his hand, calling something across the distance. Ethan caught fragments over the creek's murmur, morning, seen anyone, questions. They were asking questions about someone. The woman's grip on his arm tightened until her fingernails broke skin through the cloth. Her whole body pressed against his side now, desperate and trembling, like a newborn colt in a thunderstorm. Ethan made his choice without thinking it through. He stood up slow, hands visible and empty, and walked toward the approaching riders, left his Colt in its holster, but kept his thumb hooked in his gun belt, close enough to draw if needed. Not so obvious as to start a shooting war. "Morning, gentlemen," he called when they got within easy talking distance. The lead rider touched his hat brim, middle-aged man with a graying beard and steady eyes that had seen their share of trouble. "Morning to you. Friend, name's Walker. From the triple bar spread up north. You seen anyone pass through here? Woman traveling alone. Maybe." Ethan's face stayed neutral as Sunday service. "Can't say I have." "What's she done? Run off from her employer?" Walker's voice carried the easy authority of someone used to being believed without question. "Man's real worried about her. She ain't right in the head. If you catch my meaning, tends to wander off. Get herself in all kinds of trouble." The lie sat in the morning air, thick as smoke from greenwood. Ethan nodded slow. "What's she look like?" "Small thing. Dark hair, pulled back, proper. Probably wearing a blue calico dress." Walker leaned forward in his saddle, leather creaking. "You sure you ain't seen her horse tracks? Are pretty fresh." Leading this way, behind the log, the woman had gone completely still. Even her shaking had stopped, like she was playing dead and hoping the predators would pass her by. "Like I told you," Ethan's voice stayed level as creek water, "haven't seen hide nor hair of anyone since yesterday evening." Walker studied him for a long moment. His two companions sat quiet, hands resting easy on their saddle horns. Professional, patient. The kind of men who got paid good money to find things that didn't want to be found. "Well," Walker straightened in his saddle, "you do see her. You might want to keep your distance. Like I said, she ain't right in the head. Dangerous when she's cornered. If you take my meaning." He touched his hat brim again and wheeled his horse around. The other two followed without a word, raising dust as they loped back toward the ridge at an easy pace. Ethan waited until they disappeared over the crest before walking back to the cottonwoods. Found the woman exactly where he'd left her, pressed against that log like she was trying to become part of it. "They're gone, ma'am." She looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so young. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself upright on shaking legs. Her lips moved, shaping words he couldn't hear but understood just the same. "Thank you." He nodded once, then extended his hand to help her stand. She stared at it for a heartbeat before taking it, her fingers small and cold in his palm. As she stood, her flour sack shifted against her hip, and something metallic clinked inside. Something that made a sound he'd heard before in darker places. Something that sounded exactly like shackles. But when he looked closer, studying the way she held that sack like it contained the crown jewels, Ethan realized he might have it backwards. Maybe she wasn't carrying shackles. Maybe she was carrying the keys. They rode northwest toward Clearwater. The woman perched behind Ethan on his mare, like she might take flight at the first harsh word. Her hands gripped his belt with the desperation of someone who'd learned that safety was about as reliable as morning mist. The metallic clinking from her flour sack had stopped after she'd repositioned it against her hip. But Ethan couldn't shake that sound. Keys. Had to be keys. The question eating at him was why a woman running for her life would carry the very things that had likely bound her. Evidence. Maybe. Or insurance. Neither possibility sat well in his gut. The mare picked her way along the deer trail that followed the creek's meandering path. Hooves finding purchase on loose shale that clicked and scattered down the slope. Behind him, the woman's breathing came in careful, measured puffs against his back. She was working mighty hard to stay calm, but her death grip on his belt told a different story. At midday, when the sun had climbed high enough to make the rocks shimmer with the heat, he reined up beside a stand of aspen where the creek formed a natural pool. The woman slid down before he could offer help, her legs nearly buckling when her boots hit solid ground. "We'll rest the horse," Ethan said, then caught himself making the same mistake again. She watched his mouth, caught enough meaning to nod. Then she headed for the creek with that careful efficiency he was starting to recognize. Always working, always making herself useful, like she was paying for every moment of safety with service rendered. He unsaddled the mare and hobbled her to graze on the sweet grass that grew thick along the water's edge, then turned to find the woman kneeling by the creek bank. She'd pulled out her small bundle and was working over something with the kind of intense concentration a preacher might give to Sunday's sermon. When he got closer, he saw what had captured her attention: wild onions, growing thick in the rich soil where the creek had flooded come spring. She was harvesting them with her bone-handled knife, selecting only the best bulbs and cleaning them with the precision of a surgeon preparing for delicate work. Smart thinking. Trail food that would keep and add flavor to whatever they could hunt or buy in town. She looked up when his shadow fell across her work, pointed to the onions, then mimed eating. Her eyebrows raised in a question that needed no words. "Fine idea, ma'am," he said, then caught himself and nodded instead, giving her a thumbs up like he'd seen soldiers do during the war. Her almost smile flickered across her face, gone before it could take proper hold. She returned to her harvesting while he filled their water bottles from the cold creek. The silence between them had grown comfortable somehow, like they were settling into the rhythm of partnership. She worked her side of survival. He worked his. And together, they might just make it through whatever was coming. But when she reached for an onion growing near a fallen cottonwood, her sleeve rode up again. This time, Ethan got a clear look at both wrists in the bright midday sun. The rope burns were worse than he'd first thought, recent enough that the skin was still angry red and weeping, but underneath lay layer after layer of old scars: rope, chain, leather straps, whatever they'd used to keep her bound. They'd been doing it for a long time, years, maybe most of her adult life. The woman noticed his stare and quickly tugged her sleeves down, color flooding her cheeks like she was ashamed of marks that sure as shooting weren't her fault. Ethan's jaw worked around words that wouldn't come and shouldn't be spoken anyway. What kind of man kept a woman chained for years? What kind of animal treated another human being like? She tapped his arm, pulling him back from thoughts that led nowhere good. When he looked at her, she was pointing at something over his shoulder. Smoke. A thin gray line rising from beyond the next ridge, maybe 2 miles distant. Could be a ranch house. Could be a camp. Could be other travelers like themselves making their noon meal. Could be the men who'd been hunting her, waiting patient as spiders in their web. The woman's face had gone pale again, but she wasn't panicking this time. Instead, she pointed at the smoke, then at herself, and shook her head, firm as granite. She was telling him not to go there, warning him away from something she recognized. But as Ethan studied that distant smoke, something else caught his attention. Movement on the ridge to their south, the direction they'd come from. 3 dark specks that resolved into riders when he squinted against the afternoon glare. The same riders from this morning, Walker and his 2 companions, following the deer trail exactly where Ethan and the woman had traveled. "We need to move, ma'am." He grabbed the mare's reins and started saddling with quick, efficient movements, born of too many hasty departures. The woman saw the riders too. Her hands shook as she gathered the wild onions, stuffing them into her flour sack alongside whatever else she carried. The metallic clanking started again. Definitely keys. Now he was certain. But keys to what? And how many locks did one woman need to open? She swung up behind him without being asked, her grip on his belt tight enough to cut off circulation. The mare sensed the urgency and stepped out at a ground-eating trot toward the smoke on the horizon. Behind them, the riders crested the ridge, still too far to make out individual faces, but close enough that Ethan could see they were pushing their horses harder now. No more easy lope. They were riding like men with a deadline to meet. Professional hunters knew how to pace their mounts for a long chase. These men were riding like time mattered more than horseflesh, like they had an appointment to keep in whatever settlement lay beneath that smoke. The woman pressed closer against his back, and through the layers of cloth and leather, he could feel her heart hammering like a trapped bird's wings. Her breathing had gone shallow and quick, the kind of breathing that came before a person either fought or fainted. The smoke grew larger as they approached, resolving into the clear outline of buildings, streets. The geometric patterns that meant civilization carved from wilderness, clear water, had to be. But as they topped the final ridge and looked down into the town spread below them like a promise of safety, Ethan's blood turned to ice water in his veins. 3 horses stood tied at the hitching post in front of the sheriff's office. The same 3 horses that had been chasing them all afternoon. Their flanks dark with sweat from hard riding. The riders hadn't been following their trail after all. They'd been herding them straight into a trap. And whatever was waiting in that sheriff's office, the woman behind him was shaking so hard he could feel it through his spine. Ethan reined up on the ridge overlooking Clearwater, his mind working through options that all led to the same dead end. The woman's grip on his belt had turned desperate enough to leave permanent marks, her fingernails digging through leather to find purchase on his skin beneath. Below them, the town sprawled along both sides of a muddy main street, like something thrown together in a hurry and left to weather as best it could. False-fronted buildings lined the thoroughfare like broken teeth general store, saloon, boarding house, and at the far southern end, the sheriff's office with those 3 familiar horses tied out front like a promise of trouble. The woman leaned forward, her breath hot against his ear as she made a sound, not words, but a low keening that spoke of recognition and something deeper than ordinary fear. She knew this place, had been here before. "We can circle around," Ethan said, then caught himself and pointed east instead, away from the town toward open country. But she shook her head violent enough to make her hair come loose from its careful pins. She tugged at his sleeve, and when he turned in the saddle to look at her, she was pointing at the sun hanging low in the western sky, then at the horizon where storm clouds were building black as Judgment Day. Night was coming fast, and with it, temperatures that could kill a person caught in the open without proper shelter. The wind already carried the bite of mountain snow. Even though it was still weeks away from the high country, they needed food, warmth, and a roof overhead. And his mare was already favoring her right foreleg. She wouldn't carry them much farther without rest and grain. The woman seemed to understand their situation as clearly as he did. She pointed down at the town, then at herself, and drew a line across her throat with one finger, slow and deliberate, making sure he caught her meaning. They'd kill her if they caught her here, plain and simple, but staying in the open meant dying slow from cold and exposure, assuming the wolves didn't find them first. Ethan studied the town layout, looking for angles that might work. The main street ran north to south, with the sheriff's office anchoring the southern end. A boarding house sat about halfway down on the eastern side, marked by a hand-painted sign that read, "Patterson's Clean Beds, Good Meals," in letters faded by too many seasons. If they could reach the boarding house without being spotted from the sheriff's office, if the proprietor was the kind of person who asked few questions and kept her mouth shut, he pointed at the building, then looked back at the woman for confirmation. She followed his gesture, and something shifted in her face. Not hope exactly, but a lessening of the despair that had been eating at her since they'd spotted those horses. She nodded once, sharp and decisive as a judge's gavel. They picked their way down the back slope of the ridge, using a dry creek bed to mask their approach. The mare's hooves rang against loose stones with sounds that seemed loud as church bells in the evening quiet. But they had no choice except to trust that the gathering dusk would hide them from watching eyes. At the edge of town, Ethan dismounted and helped the woman down. Her legs shook when they took her full weight, but she managed to stand upright and keep moving. "Stay close, ma'am," he whispered, forgetting again that she couldn't hear his words. But she was already pressed against his side, moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped, like they'd been practicing this particular dance for years instead of hours. They slipped between buildings, using the deepening shadows for cover. The boarding house sat 50 yards away across an open stretch of street that might as well have been a mile of empty prairie under enemy guns. Ethan checked the sheriff's office one more time. Lamplight flickered in the windows, and he could make out silhouettes moving inside. 3 figures, maybe 4, having themselves a meeting that looked mighty serious from this distance, planning what to do with the woman once they caught her. Most likely, the thought made his jaw clench hard enough to crack teeth. They darted across the street in a crouched run, boots silent on the packed dirt. The boarding house loomed before them, 2 stories of weathered clapboard with a wide front porch that offered blessed concealment from the street. Ethan was reaching for the front door when it swung open on its own. An older woman stepped out onto the porch, gray hair pinned severe against her skull. Wearing a clean apron over a dark wool dress, she took one look at them, Ethan, with his hand hovering near his gun. The woman pressed against his side like she was trying to disappear, and her eyes went sharp with understanding. "You'd best come in quick," she said, her voice pitched low, but carrying the authority of someone used to making life or death decisions. Before Sheriff Morrison finishes his supper and starts making his evening rounds. She stepped aside, ushering them into a front parlor that smelled of beeswax and fresh bread and all the comforts of civilized living. Lace curtains covered the windows, and a coal oil lamp burned steady on a side table, casting warm light across furniture that had seen better days but was kept clean and respectable. The woman beside Ethan was staring at their hostess with something approaching wonder. She touched her chest with one trembling finger, then pointed at the older woman. "Anna!" The word came out cracked and rough, like she hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Anna." The boarding house keeper nodded, slow and careful. "I remember you, child. You used to come to town with your sister before." She let the sentence hang unfinished in the warm air. "I'm Mrs. Patterson. You're safe here. At least for now." But even as she spoke the words of comfort, heavy boots clomped across the front porch. Measured footsteps, moving with the kind of purpose that meant official business. Down. Mrs. Patterson blew out the lamp with one quick breath, plunging the parlor into darkness just as a figure appeared at the front window. A man in a badge, peering through the lace curtains with eyes that had seen too much and believed too little. Sheriff Morrison, making his evening rounds right on schedule. The figure moved toward the front door. His hand reached for the handle, testing to see if it was locked. It wasn't. The door began to swing open, hinges creaking like old bones in the sudden quiet. Lamplight from the hallway spilled across the threshold, reaching toward where Anna crouched frozen beside Ethan. In 2 more seconds, the sheriff would see them clear as Sunday morning. But as the door opened wider, something metallic clinked inside Anna's flour sack, the same sound Ethan had been hearing all day. Except this time, in the absolute quiet of the moment, he finally recognized it for what it really was. Not shackles that had bound her, keys that had freed others. And from the look of terror on Anna's face, Sheriff Morrison knew exactly what those keys unlocked. Mrs. Patterson moved like a woman half her age, stepping into the doorway and blocking the sheriff's view with her body. The lamplight from the hallway caught the steel in her gray eyes. "Evening, Sheriff Morrison. Bit late for your usual rounds, isn't it, ma'am?" Morrison's voice carried the weight of authority and something else impatience, like a man with pressing business elsewhere. "Got reports of strangers in town, man and a woman, riding double on a bay mare. Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description." Mrs. Patterson's tone stayed level, conversational as discussing the weather. Though I did serve supper to the Hartley boys about an hour past. They were talking about heading north come morning, looking for work with the railroad crews. Behind her in the darkened parlor, Anna pressed deeper into the shadows beside a tall cabinet. The keys in her flour sack had gone silent, but Ethan could see her hand clenched around the fabric. Knuckles white with strain. Keys to what? And why had she risked everything to keep them instead of throwing them in the nearest creek? Sheriff Morrison shifted his weight, boot leather creaking on the porch boards. Mind if I take a look around just to be thorough, you understand? Of course not! Sheriff! Mrs. Patterson stepped back, opening the door wider with what looked like complete cooperation. Though I should warn you, I've got Mrs. Henderson upstairs with the fever. Been caring for her all day. Wouldn't want you catching anything unpleasant. The lie rolled off her tongue, smooth as honey from the comb. Morrison paused at the threshold, hand resting on his gun belt. His eyes swept the parlor, passing over the chairs, the side table, the corner where Anna crouched motionless as carved stone. Ethan's hand found his Colt grip. If Morrison took 2 more steps into that room, if his eyes adjusted to the darkness enough to make out shapes in the corners, a child's cough echoed from somewhere upstairs, followed by a woman's voice calling weakly for water. Mrs. Patterson had boarders, real ones, going about their evening business like normal folks. Morrison's attention shifted toward the ceiling. The Henderson woman, she'd been sick long, 3 days now. Poor thing. Mrs. Patterson pitched her voice just right, concerned, but not overly dramatic. The way a good Christian woman should sound when discussing a neighbor's misfortune. Dr. Mackenzie says it might be consumption. I've been doing what I can, but you know how these things go. And the sheriff backed toward the door. Consumption was nothing to gamble with in a territory where the nearest real doctor was 3 days' ride away. A man could catch his death from bad air, and everyone knew it. Well, Morrison touched his hat brim. You see those strangers, you send word right away. There's a reward involved. Good money for information leading to their capture. I'll certainly keep my eyes open. Sheriff, the door closed with a soft click. Mrs. Patterson waited until Morrison's footsteps faded down the street before lighting the lamp again, her hand steady as a preacher's during Sunday service. Anna unfolded from the shadows like a woman coming back from the dead. Her face had gone gray as old paper, but her hand still clutched that flour sack like it contained the most precious thing in creation. Child. Mrs. Patterson's voice gentled as she looked at Anna properly for the first time in years. What in the Lord's name have you been through? Anna touched her throat, shook her head. The words wouldn't come, even if she could make them heard above a whisper. Instead, she reached into her flour sack and withdrew what Ethan had been hearing all day. Not shackles, a ring of iron keys, each one different from its neighbors, some large enough for cell doors, others small and delicate, like they might open jewelry boxes or diary locks. She held them toward Mrs. Patterson, her eyes wide with some desperate need to communicate something that had no words. Mrs. Patterson took the keys. Examining them in the lamplight, her face went through a series of changes, confusion at first, then recognition, and finally, something that looked like horror mixed with righteous anger. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. "These are from the Corbett place." Anna nodded so hard, her hair came completely loose from its pins, falling around her shoulders like a dark curtain. Then she mimed turning a key in a lock, her hands shaking as she rolled up her sleeves to reveal not just the rope burns Ethan had seen, but something worse underneath. Brand marks, small and deliberate, scarred into the soft skin of her inner wrists like a rancher might mark his cattle. Property marks. Mrs. Patterson's face hardened into something that could cut glass. "Silas Corbett did this to you?" Anna nodded again, then pointed toward the sheriff's office with one trembling finger, her meaning clear as church bells on Sunday morning. Morrison was working with Corbett. The law was bought and paid for with money that came from treating human beings like livestock. "How many others?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Anna held up her fingers. 5, then 5 again, then 3 more, counting careful to make sure the number was right. 13 women, 13 keys. The full picture slammed into Ethan's chest like a mule kick to the ribs. Anna hadn't just escaped from whatever hell Corbett was running, she'd unlocked every cage in the place and turned them all loose. That's why the riders were pushing so hard. Why Morrison was involved. Why they'd herded Anna and Ethan straight into town instead of just taking her on the open trail. She hadn't just run away from bondage. She'd started a revolution. And now every missing woman in 3 counties was running free with Anna's keys in their hands, while the men who'd owned them scrambled to cover their tracks before word reached the territorial capital. But as the full implications settled in Ethan's mind, like stones in still water, a new sound reached his ears through the boarding house walls. Horses, multiple horses, moving fast down the main street with the urgency of men who'd run out of patience. Anna heard it too, not the sound itself, but the vibration through the floorboards under her feet. Her eyes went wide as she felt the thunder of approaching hooves. Mrs. Patterson blew out the lamp again, plunging them back into darkness just as riders pounded past the boarding house. Ethan counted at least 6 horses, maybe more, all moving at a hard gallop. Too many for the 3 men who'd been hunting them since morning. Reinforcements had arrived from wherever men like Corbett kept their hired muscle. And through the lace curtains, Ethan could see them, pulling up in front of the sheriff's office, dismounting with the efficiency of professionals who'd done this kind of work before. One of the riders struck a match to light a cigarette, and in the brief flare of flame, Ethan got a clear look at his face. It wasn't Sheriff Morrison or any of his local deputies. It was a man he recognized from wanted posters that decorated every sheriff's office and marshal station from here to Kansas Jack Slade, bounty hunter and worse. The kind of man who brought back his quarry breathing only if the reward specified it that way. They weren't planning to arrest Anna and put her on trial. They were planning to make her disappear permanent-like. And from the sound of more horses approaching from the north end of town, Jack Slade hadn't come alone. The bounty hunters spread across the street like wolves working a kill. Ethan counted 8 men through the lace curtains, all armed, all moving with the practiced efficiency of professionals who'd hunted human beings before and knew how it was done. Anna sank to the floor beside the window, her whole body trembling as she watched Jack Slade gesture toward the buildings with casual authority, dividing up the town, assigning targets like a general planning a siege. They were going door to door, and everybody in Clearwater knew it. Mrs. Patterson grabbed Anna's shoulders, pulling her away from the window. "Root cellar," she whispered. "There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen. You can hide there until—" Anna shook her head violent enough to make her loose hair whip across her face. She pointed at Mrs. Patterson, then at herself, then drew that familiar line across her throat. If they found Anna here, they'd kill the older woman for harboring a fugitive, even terrified out of her wits. She was thinking clearer than most folks did in calm weather, trying to protect the woman who'd shown her kindness. "Back door," Ethan said, checking his Colt's cylinder by feel. 6 shots against 8 professional killers. The arithmetic didn't favor survival. But staying put guaranteed a shallow grave behind the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson led them through a narrow hallway that smelled of lye soap and old wood polish. The kitchen sat at the rear of the house, dominated by a cast-iron stove that still radiated heat from the evening meal. A door opened onto a small back porch that overlooked an alley barely wide enough for a man and horse. Empty for the moment. "There's a livery stable 2 blocks north," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "Henderson keeps horses there for travelers. If you can reach it without being seen." Heavy boots thundered on the front porch. Fists pounded against the door hard enough to rattle the windows in their frames. "Open up. Territorial, martial, business." Mrs. Patterson's face went pale as milk. They weren't even pretending to be local law anymore. This was federal authority. Or at least someone claiming it. Anna pressed something into Ethan's palm, 2 of the keys from her ring. Small ones, delicate as jewelry, warm from her body heat. Her eyes held a message he couldn't read, but felt in his chest like a physical weight pressing down. Important. Whatever these keys unlocked was important enough to die for. The front door splintered inward with a crash that shook the whole house like an earthquake. Heavy boots stomped through the parlor, voices calling out orders with military precision. "Check upstairs. Kitchen. Don't let her reach the back." They knew the layout of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, had been here before, or had someone draw them a detailed map. Anna bolted for the back door. Ethan right behind her. They burst onto the porch just as 2 riders rounded the corner of the alley at a hard gallop. Guns already drawn and aimed. Trap. They'd covered every exit before making their move. The riders opened fire while their horses were still in motion. Muzzle flashes strobed in the gathering darkness, bullets chewing splinters from the porch rail and whistling past Ethan's ear close enough to part his hair. Ethan shoved Anna sideways, behind a water barrel, and returned fire. His first shot took the lead rider in the shoulder, spinning him sideways in his saddle like a child's toy. The second shot missed clean, but it spooked the horses and bought them precious seconds of confusion. Behind them, the kitchen door exploded open. Men poured through like water through a broken dam, boots skidding on the wooden floor. Anna grabbed Ethan's sleeve and pointed toward a narrow gap between 2 buildings, barely wide enough for a person, too tight for horses to follow. They ran. The alley pressed close on both sides, brick walls scraping their shoulders as they squeezed through like rats in a maze. Behind them came shouts and curses as the bounty hunters tried to follow on foot. Around front, "Cut them off at Miller's store. Don't let them reach the church." They emerged onto a side street that ran parallel to the main thoroughfare. Anna stumbled, went down hard on her knees in the mud and horse droppings that carpeted the ground. When she tried to stand, Her left leg buckled beneath her, bullet graze along her thigh, blood soaking through her dress, dark as spilled wine. Ethan hauled her upright, his arm around her waist, taking most of her weight. She bit down on her lip hard enough to draw blood, but no sound escaped her throat. Even in pain, even bleeding, she was silent as the grave. 2 blocks to the livery stable. Might as well be 2 miles with her unable to walk proper. They limped forward, using the shadows between buildings for what little cover they offered. Anna's blood left a trail in the mud that any fool could follow, but stopping to bind the wound meant certain death. The stable materialized out of the darkness ahead, a low-slung building with a hayloft and the sweet smell of horses and grain. The main door stood slightly ajar, lamplight flickering inside like a beacon. Too easy. Had to be another trap. But Anna was getting heavier against his side, her breathing shallow and quick. Blood loss was taking its toll, and the wound needed tending soon, or it would turn septic and kill her slower than any bullet. Ethan pushed open the stable door and immediately regretted every choice that had brought them to this moment. Mrs. Henderson sat tied to a wooden chair in the middle of the barn, gag stuffed in her mouth, eyes wide with terror. Above the dirty cloth, blood trickled from her nose where someone had struck her for not cooperating fast enough. Jack Slade stepped out of an empty stall, gun already drawn and aimed steady at Ethan's chest. His smile showed teeth like broken glass. "Figured you'd head here eventually." Slade's voice carried the lazy confidence of a man holding all the cards in a rigged game. "Drop the iron, Drifter. Nice and slow, unless you want to see what the lady's blood looks like mixed with hay." Ethan's Colt hit the straw-covered floor with a dull thud that seemed loud as thunder. "Good boy." Slade's eyes shifted to Anna, who was barely staying upright despite Ethan's support. "And there's our little runaway. You've caused us quite a bit of trouble, haven't you, darling? Cost some important people a lot of money." Anna lifted her chin, meeting Slade's stare with something that might have been defiance if she hadn't been bleeding all over the stable floor. Her free hand clutched the flour sack containing those precious keys, holding them against her chest like armor that might stop bullets through faith alone. "Oh, we're going to have some long conversations. You and me." Slade's grin widened, showing more of those broken teeth. "Soon as we get you back to Mr. Corbett's place. He's real eager to discuss what you did with his property. Real eager indeed." The property he meant wasn't just the other women Anna had freed. It was Anna herself. But as Slade gestured with his gun, motioning toward the stable doors where more men waited in the darkness, Mrs. Henderson made a sound behind her gag. Not fear or pain, but warning, sharp and urgent. And in the hayloft above their heads, something creaked like old floorboards under a careful footstep. Someone else was in the barn. Someone Slade didn't know about. Someone who might just even the odds, if they had the sand to try. The creak from the hayloft came again, louder this time, like someone shifting their weight on old boards. Slade's eyes flicked upward for just a heartbeat, but that was enough. Ethan dove sideways, tackling Anna to the ground behind a feed trough as gunfire exploded through the stable. Not from above, from outside. The other bounty hunters had found them, muzzle flashes strobing through the doorway like deadly lightning. Slade spun toward the stable doors, returning fire at shapes moving in the darkness beyond. His shot went wide, splintering wood above the doorframe and sending splinters raining down like hail. In the chaos, Mrs. Henderson had worked one hand free of her bonds. She grabbed the coal oil lamp from its hook on the wall and hurled it at the pile of loose hay beneath the loft. Flames roared to life, casting wild shadows that danced across the stable walls like demons. Horses whinnied in terror from their stalls, kicking at the wooden doors with hooves that sounded like thunder. Anna pressed the remaining keys into Ethan's hand, her fingers slick with blood from the bullet graze. Her lips moved, shaping words he couldn't hear over the gunfire and crackling flames. Find them, the women, the other women who'd escaped Corbett's hell. The keys were the only proof of what that monster had done, the only evidence that could bring justice instead of just revenge. Slade wheeled around, gun aimed at Anna's head, where she lay bleeding beside the feed trough. Enough games, girl. Time to... A pitchfork dropped from the loft above. Tynes, first like a spear thrown by an angry god. It caught Slade in the shoulder, driving him to his knees with a scream that cut through the noise of burning hay and panicking horses. A small figure dropped from the loft, a boy, maybe 12 years old, dressed in clothes too big for his thin frame. Mrs. Henderson's son, Tommy, hidden in the hay when the bounty hunters came calling. The boy looked at Slade writhing on the ground with a pitchfork sticking out of his shoulder, then at Anna, bleeding beside the feed trough, and his young face hardened into something older than his years should have allowed. He kicked Slade's gun away from his reaching fingers, sending it spinning across the straw-covered floor. More shots from outside. The other bounty hunters were closing in, using the fire's light to pick their targets through the smoke that was starting to fill the stable. Anna struggled to her feet, using the feed trough for support. Blood had soaked through her dress from hip to knee, but she was moving, fighting to stay conscious. She pointed at the back of the stable, where another door led into the alley behind the building. Run, her gesture said. Get away while you can. But Ethan was done running like a yellow dog with his tail between his legs. He'd spent months drifting from place to place, avoiding trouble, avoiding commitment, avoiding anything that required him to stand for something bigger than his own skin. But watching this woman, this broken, brave woman who'd risked everything to free people she barely knew, he couldn't just keep running forever. Not anymore. Not when it mattered. He picked up Slade's gun and checked the cylinder. 4 rounds left. It would have to be enough. Young Tommy was cutting Mrs. Henderson free with a pocket knife, his hands shaking but determined as any grown man. Ma, we need to get out of here. Fire's spreading too fast. Mrs. Henderson rubbed circulation back into her wrists, her face grim but resolute. You're right, son. This whole place will be an inferno in minutes. She was right. The flames had caught the hay in the loft, sending burning fragments drifting down like deadly snow. Soon the whole building would be a furnace, and they'd all roast like Sunday dinner. Anna tugged at Ethan's sleeve, pointing toward the rear door again. Her eyes held a desperate plea. Don't die for me. Don't throw your life away for someone like me. But as she pulled at his arm, her injured leg gave out completely. She collapsed against the feed trough, consciousness wavering from blood loss and pain and the smoke that was getting thicker by the minute. The bounty hunters' voices grew closer outside. They had the stable surrounded now, just waiting for the fire to drive their quarry into the open, into their guns. Ethan looked at Anna slumped against the feed trough, at Mrs. Henderson and her boy, at the keys warm in his palm. 13 keys for 13 women who'd found freedom because one deaf girl had refused to accept that some people could be owned like livestock. He could run, take Anna, and slip out the back while the bounty hunters watched the front. Leave Mrs. Henderson and Tommy to face whatever came next. Save himself, like he'd been doing his whole miserable life. It would be the smart thing to do. The safe thing, the coward's way. But as Anna's eyes fluttered closed, her hand still clutching his arm like an anchor to the world of the living, Ethan realized he was bone tired of being smart. He was tired of being safe. He was tired of being the kind of man who rode away when decent people needed him most. The stable door burst open. 3 bounty hunters silhouetted against the night sky, guns drawn, confident they had their prey cornered like rats in a burning box. Ethan stepped out from behind the feed trough, Slade's gun steady in his hand despite the smoke and heat and his own hammering heart. Evening. Boys. His first shot dropped the lead man like a stone. His second sent the other 2 diving for cover behind the water troughs outside. But as he thumbed back the hammer for a third shot, he heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. More horses coming fast from the north end of town, hooves pounding like thunder on the packed earth, and leading them, unmistakable even in the firelight and smoke, rode a man in an expensive suit mounted on a sorrel gelding with a distinctive white blaze. Silas Corbett had come to collect his property personally. And from the look on his face as he surveyed the burning stable, he wasn't planning to take Anna back alive. Corbett reined up outside the burning stable, his sorrel dancing sideways from the heat and smoke billowing through the doorway. In the firelight, his face looked carved from expensive marble, handsome, in the way that successful men were handsome. All clean lines and cold calculation. Stand down. All of you. His voice cut through the crackling flames and panicked horse screams like a blade through silk. This has gone far enough. The remaining bounty hunters lowered their guns without question. Even wounded Jack Slade stopped trying to pull the pitchfork from his shoulder. Recognizing the voice of the man who paid their wages, Anna's eyes snapped open at the sound of Corbett's words. She pushed herself upright against the feed trough, her face going white as old bones in the flickering light. There's my Anna. Corbett dismounted with fluid grace, brushing dust from his tailored coat like he was attending a church social instead of standing outside a burning building. You've led us quite a chase, haven't you, my dear? He walked into the stable like he owned it and everything inside, like he owned everything he looked at, including the people. Mr. Corbett. Sheriff Morrison emerged from the shadows behind the bounty hunters, badge glinting in the firelight. She's wounded. Might not survive the trip back to your establishment. Oh, she'll survive. Corbett's eyes never left Anna's face, studying her like a man appraising livestock at market. She's tougher than she appears. Aren't you, dear heart? Anna's hand found the feed trough edge. gripping the rough wood so hard her knuckles went white as knuckle bones. But she didn't look away from the man who'd branded her like cattle. Ethan raised Slade's gun, aiming center mass at Corbett's chest. "She's not going anywhere with you, mister." Corbett glanced at him like noticing a stray dog in his path. "And you are someone who's seen what you do to women who can't fight back." "What I do?" Corbett's laugh was cultured, educated, the kind that came from fancy schools back out east and money that went back generations. "I provide shelter for unfortunates who have nowhere else to turn. Food, clothing, protection from the harsh realities of frontier life." The lies rolled off his tongue smooth as Sunday morning preaching. "In exchange for what?" Corbett's smile was a blade wrapped in silk and good manners. "Honest work. Of course. These women have valuable skills cooking, cleaning, certain other domestic talents that are much appreciated. They earn their keep through honest labor." Behind him, Sheriff Morrison nodded along like this made perfect Christian sense, like the brand marks on Anna's wrists were just figments of a diseased imagination. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward from where she'd been helping Tommy tend to Slade's wound. "Honest work doesn't require branding people like cattle." Mr. Corbett, Corbett's eyebrows rose in practiced surprise. The picture of wounded innocence. "Sheriff Morrison, have you seen any evidence of such treatment? Any proof of mistreatment or abuse?" Morrison shook his head like a faithful dog. "Just a lot of wild stories from a woman who clearly ain't right in the head." "Mr. Corbett," Anna's mouth opened, shaped words that came out cracked and barely audible. 13 women. "Delusions," Corbett said smoothly, his voice carrying the authority of education and money, "brought on by her unfortunate condition. The poor dear imagines all sorts of fantastic scenarios." He took a step closer to Anna, and she shrank back against the feed trough like a beaten animal. "It's time to come home, Anna. You're not well. You need proper medical care." The keys in Ethan's pocket seemed to burn against his leg through the cloth. Evidence of 13 locks, 13 cages, 13 women who'd found freedom because Anna had risked everything to give it to them. But evidence only mattered if someone with real authority was willing to look at it. And Sheriff Morrison's authority came with Corbett's money attached like a chain around his neck. "The territorial judge," Ethan said. "When's he due through here next?" Morrison's face tightened, like he'd bitten into something sour. "Ain't your concern, drifter?" "Judge Henley comes through monthly," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying clearly through the stable despite the smoke. "Should be here day after tomorrow. Lord willing." Corbett's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. The first crack in his perfect composure. "Unfortunately," he said, "Anna can't wait that long for proper medical attention. Look at her. She's clearly in severe distress." Anna was in distress. No denying that. Blood loss had left her gray-faced and shaking like autumn leaves. But her eyes held something Ethan recognized now. Something he'd been carrying in his own chest for months. Not just fear or pain, rage, cold, patient fury at the injustice of it all. "She stays here," Ethan said, "until the judge arrives." "I'm afraid that's not possible." Corbett's hand moved to the gun at his hip, expensive piece, silver-plated, Probably never been fired except at targets. Rich man's gun. You see, Anna belongs to me. Legally, I have the proper documentation. Show me. Corbett reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded document sealed with red wax. Even in the firelight, Ethan could see the official stamps, the careful penmanship. Anna's mark scrawled at the bottom like a child's first attempt at writing. Debt bondage contract, Corbett said. Perfectly legal in this territory. Anna's deceased father owed me substantial sums of money. She agreed to work off the debt through honest labor. Anna shook her head frantically, her hands shaping desperate signs that no one else in that stable could read. But Ethan was learning her language. One gesture at a time, forced, coerced, never agreed to anything. Contracts signed under duress ain't worth the paper they're written on, he said. Prove duress. Corbett's smile was sharp as broken glass. Prove coercion. Prove anything except that a simple-minded woman signed a legal document in the presence of witnesses. The keys. The keys could prove it. 13 locks for 13 women, all bearing Corbett's personal seal. But the moment Ethan produced them, Corbett's men would gun him down where he stood. Sheriff Morrison would swear it was self-defense. The keys would disappear into whatever fire was convenient, along with any hope of justice for Anna and the others. Anna must have read his thoughts. She caught his eye and shook her head minutely, warning him off. Not yet. Not like this. Smart woman, even bleeding and terrified. She was thinking 3 moves ahead, like a chess master. The matter is settled. Corbett stepped forward, extending his hand toward Anna like a gentleman asking for a dance. Come along, my dear. Time to go home where you belong. Anna pressed deeper against the feed trough. Her whole body trembled, but she didn't take his offered hand. Anna, Corbett's voice hardened like steel underneath the silk. Don't make this more difficult than necessary. Still, she didn't move. Corbett nodded to 2 of his men. They moved forward, reaching for Anna's arms with the casual efficiency of men who'd done this work many times before. That's when the church bells started ringing. Not the gentle chimes that called folks to evening service. The harsh, urgent clanging that meant fire or flood or trouble too big for ordinary folks to handle alone. Mrs. Henderson's boy, Tommy, was standing by the stable's rear door, bell rope in his hands, grinning like he'd just pulled off the greatest trick in creation. He'd slipped out during the confusion and rung the alarm. The whole town was about to come running to see what the commotion was about. And Judge Henley, territorial circuit judge, had arrived a day early. His black buggy was already rolling down Main Street, drawn by the sound of the bells and the glow of the fire against the night sky. Corbett's perfect plan was falling apart like a house built on sand. And Anna, bleeding, broken Anna who'd survived hell itself, was smiling through her tears. The circuit judge's arrival changed everything in ways that courtroom justice never could have managed on its own. Judge Henley examined Corbett's papers with the thoroughness of a man who'd seen too many forged documents in his years on the bench. But it was Anna's testimony given through careful signs that Mrs. Patterson translated with the reverence of someone interpreting scripture that revealed the truth hidden behind all that legal language. The 13 keys unlocked more than doors and shackles. They unlocked voices that had been silent too long. One by one, The freed women emerged from hiding places throughout the territory, each carrying stories that painted a picture no amount of money could whitewash clean. Corbett's empire crumbled not through violence, but through the simple power of truth, spoken by those who'd lived it. Sheriff Morrison found himself facing federal charges for corruption. The bounty hunters scattered like leaves before an autumn storm. Ethan and Anna were married in the same courthouse where justice had finally prevailed. Their vows were spoken in two languages, his words, her signs, but the meaning was universal as sunrise. They built a small homestead outside Clearwater, where Anna's cooking drew neighbors from miles around like iron filings to a magnet. She taught the local children to communicate with their hands, giving them a gift that transcended sound and silence both. Some battles are won not with guns and fury, but with the quiet courage to stand witness when it matters most. Some victories taste like fresh bread shared freely at a common table, like coffee brewed strong enough to wake the dead, like the gentle touch of hands that have known both cruelty and kindness. In the end, they discovered what folks have always known, but sometimes forget. Home isn't a place you stumble upon during your wanderings. It's something you build together, one act of faith at a time, with people who see your worth even when you can't see it yourself. Now, I've told you this story not because it's particularly unusual. Lord knows the frontier was full of broken people finding their way to wholeness, but because it reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts of decency can change the world for or someone who desperately needs changing. Anna's still teaching children to sign, though her hair's gone silver now. Ethan tends their garden and tells stories to the grandchildren who visit every Sunday after church. And somewhere in a box in their kitchen, 13 rusty keys serve as bookmarks in Anna's Bible, a reminder that freedom, once given, can never truly be taken away. Disclaimer: this work is inspired by the Western frontier tradition, created solely for entertainment purposes. The story does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, and any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental.